Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 602. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. I have a lot to talk about on today's show, so I'm going to get right into it. But first, I just want to remind you where you could share the show from, and if you're a new listener, where you could subscribe to the show so you don't miss an episode. The show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute, where I'm the news editor and also write news articles for that site nearly every day. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com, where I am the opinion editor and work on the viewpoints. Then we have the video version of the show at YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. And the audio version is up anywhere you can listen to podcasts. You can follow me on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_. I post all the articles I write, articles that I think are important, most articles that I talk about on the show, and of course, every episode of this show. Now let's get into it, and we're starting off with some pretty striking news here. Ukraine Syrskyi says France to send instructors to train Ukrainian troops. So on Monday, the Ukrainian commander-in-chief Syrskyi said France was planning to send instructors to Ukraine to train Ukrainian troops, a step that would mark a significant escalation of NATO's involvement in the Proxy war. So this is what he posted on Telegram. Syrskyi, that is. I am pleased to welcome France's initiative to send instructors to Ukraine to train Ukrainian servicemen. I have already signed the documents that will enable the first French instructors to visit our training center shortly and familiarize themselves with the infrastructure and the personnel. So, when asked about his comments, the French Defense Ministry acknowledged that the issue of sending troops to Ukraine for training was being discussed, but gave no indication if the deployment was imminent. He said, as already mentioned several times, training on Ukrainian soil is one of the projects discussed since the conference on support for Ukraine convened by the President of the Republic on February 26th. Like all projects discussed at the time, this track continues to be the subject of work with the Ukrainians, in particular to understand their exact needs. And so just to get into this and break it down, what could be happening here, I think number one, and probably the most likely at this point, France, and then possibly along with Estonia and Lithuania, are preparing and will shortly deploy what is likely to be, at least initially, a small number of trainers to Ukrainian soil. I'm not sure we're probably talking about under 100, maybe a few dozen from each country, 50 from France, then 20 from Estonia and Lithuania, something like that. And there's a couple possibilities here. One, that they're all going to be training, or two, maybe they'll engage in some non-combat jobs to try to free up a few Ukrainian soldiers to go to the front. Either way, this would be extremely provocative and really increase the risk of a direct Russia-NATO war. I think it's possible, if not likely, that Russia would try to target these training centers where the NATO troops are. And of course, if Russia kills NATO soldiers in Ukraine, who knows how the West is going to respond? And in fact, one has to wonder if that's a part of what's going on here, that these soldiers are essentially meant to act as a tripwire. That they know that if Russia kills these soldiers, then this is going to be an excuse to really ramp up the West's direct involvement in the war and to mobilize the people of those countries, saying, look, Russia's attacking our soldiers now. They're killing our soldiers, so we have to do something about this. NATO says we have to do something about this. And that's how they're really going to raise the alarm here. Now, I do want to say, I think there's another possibility here. And we have seen this time and time again throughout the war in Ukraine, where as Ukraine is failing and its troops are losing ground and things are probably getting pretty desperate right now in Kiev, they're probably really trying to do everything they can to find recruits to send to the front lines and just stop the Russian advance in any way possible. That if Ukraine is getting desperate and maybe starting to consider negotiations, maybe the West, in order to keep them fighting, is looking at, hanging out some red meat for the Ukrainians to keep dragging them along. I think this is essentially what happened with the F-35. Of course, those are supposed to be in Ukraine last year, then earlier this year, then a couple months ago, then right around this time they should have been arriving. And there's no indication that the F-16s are anywhere near ready. And in fact, by the time they hit the battlefield, Russia will likely be very well prepared for them. And even Ukrainian military officials have admitted they probably won't make a very big difference on the battlefield. And so I think it's possible here that France is saying that, yeah, we're going to do this. So in a couple weeks, we'll figure out the logistics and make sure we can send a maybe 5 sets of our soldiers to Ukraine, and we'll look at some sites and we'll figure out if any of them could possibly be built into training facilities. And then maybe we'll build the training facilities. And so, we're already probably looking at the end of 2024 for this deployment, but then it could get drug out even more further and further and further. And so this could just be dragging Ukraine along. The New York Times recently reported that Ukraine has asked NATO to deploy troops to its territory to train 150,000 fresh recruits that it's hoping to mobilize. The report said NATO countries were inching closer to obliging the request. Although talk about the potential deployment has highlighted the fact that there are already a small number of unofficial presence of NATO special operator forces inside Ukraine. However, what is being discussed now would likely be a much larger official deployment, and any NATO troops would be at risk of being targeted by Russia. So we know, again, that American, Brits, Lithuanians, I think some Canadians are on the ground in Ukraine at this point. The Brits seem to have the biggest role in that is helping Ukraine to fire the Storm Shadow missiles, at least of what we know so far. Of course, the Americans passing the intelligence they're passing is probably really important to the Ukrainian war effort as well. All right, next up here. Sweden says Ukraine can use Swedish weapons on Russian territory. So Sweden has given Ukraine the green light to use Swedish weapons in attack on Russian territory, a move that is seen as an effort to influence other NATO countries to supply long-range missiles to do the same, the Defense Post reported on Monday. So the Swedish defense minister was asked about the possibility of Ukraine using Swedish weapons on Russian territory and replied, Ukraine has the right to defend itself through military actions aimed at the enemy's territory, as long as those military actions comply with the laws of war. Since Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, Sweden has provided Ukraine with about $3.5 million in military aid, including anti-ship missiles, anti-tank launchers, and Archer self-propelled howitzers. According to the Ukrainian news agency Defense Express, the Archer's howitzers could hit targets up to 37 miles away if armed with the GPS Excalibur artillery shells. However, Russian electronic warfare has rendered the Excalibur artillery shells as ineffective. So the Swedish defense minister's comments came amid growing calls for Ukraine to be allowed to use NATO missiles on strikes in the Russian mainland in the wake of Moscow's Kharkiv offensive, which was launched from Russia's Belgorod Oblast. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg joined the calls on Sunday and Secretary of State Antony Blinken is reportedly pushing for President Biden to lift the restrictions on Ukraine's use of U.S. weapons. On Monday, the Kremlin condemned Stoltenberg's comments. This is what Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, said. NATO is increasing the degree of escalation. NATO is flirting with military rhetoric and falling into military ecstasy. The UK has said that Ukraine could use its arms to attack Russian territory, but there is no sign yet that British missiles have been used in strikes inside of Russia. And although both the US and British weapons have been frequently used in attacks on Crimea, Russia appears to have set a red line on NATO weapons hitting the Russian mainland and seems to understand at least there's some nuance in the situation with Crimea. And this is something we have mentioned on the last episode of the show that Stoltenberg had told The Economist. The time has come for allies to consider whether they should lift some of the restrictions they have put on the use of weapons that they have donated to Ukraine. So again, hopefully this doesn't happen. I'm very worried that it will. and Russia is going to respond by really stepping up its attacks on Ukraine. And I'm sure Russia is probably somewhat aware of where the Western forces are in Ukraine. Maybe not all of them, like they have GPS tracking devices on all the forces or something, but they probably do know where they are at times. And so this could maybe be a retaliation that we see where Russia starts attacking where they know the Western forces are, since they're helping Ukraine carry out attacks inside of Russia. All right. Next up here, this one from Dave DeCamp, May 27th, antiwar.com. NATO allies skeptical about Stoltenberg's $100 billion plan for Ukraine. So NATO allies are seeking clarification about a proposal by NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg to provide Ukraine with over $100 billion in military aid over 5 years, Politico reported on Sunday. The proposal is a part of a plan to ensure long-term NATO support for Ukraine, to tie the hands of a future American president who may want to wind the world down, known as, quote, Trump-proofing. Although former President Trump has backed House Speaker Mike Johnson as he advances $61 billion spending on the Proxy war. Stoltenberg first proposed the plan in April, and once the details worked out before NATO leaders hold a summit in Washington in July, but the Politico reported said more allies are reserved about the plan as it is unclear where all the money will come from. So an Eastern European official said, the plan is a bit confusing. The officials hope that Stoltenberg will provide more clarity during the meeting of NATO foreign ministers in Prague on Thursday and Friday. Another official expects the initial sum of money Stoltenberg proposed to be revised to a smaller figure. Politico previously reported that one idea would be to involve 32 members of the alliance contributing to a $100 billion fund at the same rate they contribute to the alliance's budget. That would put most of the burden on the U.S. since Washington pays 2/3 of NATO's budget. Stoltenberg and many NATO countries are determined to keep the battlefield, the Proxy war going at all costs, despite Ukraine having no chance of victory on the battlefield. And so this would be a huge cost for the United States. We're talking about $66 billion here. Another $66 billion for the war in Ukraine. I really hope it doesn't happen. I'm sure that if the U.S. gets on board with it, a lot of the other European countries will be willing to, because, again, the U.S. is paying 2/3 of the burden there. All right, this one from the South China Morning Post. China begins military drills around Taiwan. This is from, I think, the end of last week, or middle of last week, actually. So the People's Liberation Army has launched a 2-day exercise around Taiwan, 3 days after William Lai Ching-te was sworn in as the Taiwanese leader. The joint drills include mainland Chinese Army, Navy, Air Force, and rocket forces, according to the PLA's Eastern Theater Command. The PLA said the exercises will focus on naval and air combat readiness, patrols, seizing battlefield control, precision strikes of crucial targets, as well as warship and aircraft patrols near the island to test joint combat and real combat capabilities for theater forces. Beijing slammed Lai's inauguration speech, accusing him of being more radical in his approach and sending a dangerous signal to Taiwan on independence. Now, we also have Representative Michael McCaul, the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, ready to lead a delegation to Taiwan. So Representative Michael McCaul, the House Foreign Affairs Committee head, and is leading a bipartisan congressional delegation to Taiwan, a trip that came after China concluded 2 days of military drills around the island that it launched in response to the inauguration of President William Lai. Lai, a member of the independence-leaning Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, took a more confrontational tone towards the mainland in his inauguration speech than his predecessor, Tsai Ing-wen, who was also a member of the DPP, and he was her vice president. So that's Lai was Tsai's vice president. Beijing launched military exercises that it said were punishment for separatist acts, referring to Lai's speech. The exercise involved simulating a blockade on Taiwan, marking the most extensive drills around the island since then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi traveled to Taiwan in August of 2022. China is against all congressional visits to Taiwan and strongly criticized McCall's delegation. So this is a statement from the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning. She said, in regard of the China's strong opposition, relevant members of U.S. Congress shall decide to visit Taiwan, which violates the One China principle, the Three China U.S. joint communiques, and the U.S. government's own political commitment. McCall made the provocative comments during the start of his visit, warning Congress could declare war on China if it attacked Taiwan. He said, if the island is an unprovoked manner was invaded, then it would be up to the American people and the United States Congress and my committee that has the power to declare war, how to deal with that. And you see they use the word unprovoked manner there. It sounds like they're trying to do a Ukraine here where they're going to provoke China into invading Taiwan and then claim it was unprovoked. So McCall added that for now his job is to seek deterrence to avoid war, but said that the strategy the U.S. is pursuing is raising tensions in the region and is making the conflict more likely. Increased U.S. military and diplomatic support for Taiwan in recent years has put the island under significantly more Chinese military pressure. The congressional delegation vowed that more U.S. weapons are on the way to Taiwan. The U.S. has sold weapons to Taiwan since Washington severed diplomatic relations with Taipei in 1979, but only began providing military aid last year, marking a significant escalation in U.S. support for the island. The $95 billion foreign military aid bill that Biden signed into law last month included about $8 billion in military aid for Taiwan and other spending in the region. The $8 billion for the Asia Pacific region received more support in the House than aid for Ukraine and Israel, passing overwhelmingly in a vote of 385 to 34. And this is something that we've talked about a lot on the show, that when it comes to Ukraine or Gaza, there may be some Republicans or Democrats who are opposed to that aid, but when it comes to China, it seems like this is the one that they really all agree on. So McCall noted the strong bipartisan support for arming Taiwan. Even though there are debates about our theater of war, I can tell you there's no division, no dissension when it comes to Taiwan in Congress. And he does seem to be right about that point at least. All right, this one here from Dave DeCamp, May 27th, antiwar.com. U.S. appears to justify Israel's Rafah massacre that killed 45 Palestinians. The White House on Monday appeared to justify the Israeli strike on a displaced Palestinians in Rafah that hit a tent camp that killed at least 45 people, including many women and children. In a statement on a massacre, the White House National Security Council spokesperson called it heartbreaking, but also said that Israel has a right to go after Hamas and that it backed Israelis' claims that the strikes also killed 2 Hamas figures. So the spokesperson said, according to CNN, the devastating images following the IDF strike on Rafah last night that killed dozens of innocent Palestinians are heartbreaking. Israel has a right to go after Hamas, and we understand that the strike killed 2 senior Hamas terrorists who are responsible for attacks against Israeli civilians. According to Doctors Without Borders, the Israeli strikes hit a camp in the western Rafah that was designated as a so-called safe zone by the Israeli military. Gaza's health ministry said the dead included 12 women, 8 children, and 3 elderly people. Another 3 bodies were burned beyond recognition. Footage that surfaced online showed large fires in the camp and severely burned corpses being pulled out. One video shows a man holding the body of a headless child. Axios reported that the U.S. is assessing whether or not the massacre crossed President Biden's red line although it's not clear if he has really set one. After Biden warned he would withhold heavy bombs from Israel if it launched a major attack on population centers in Rafah, the U.S. ended up supporting the Israeli attack on the city. After Israel initially claimed the Rafah massacre was a targeted attack, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called it a tragic mistake and said Israel would investigate the strike. Israeli officials had previously claimed they would investigate civilian casualties, but there are usually no follow-ups, and the U.S. appears to be happy to stay ignorant of the Israeli war crimes. Earlier this month, the State Department issued a report saying the U.S. was likely violating international law in Gaza with U.S. provided weapons, but claimed there wasn't enough evidence to prove it. The claim that there is no proof allows for the Biden administration to keep shipping weapons to Israel. And so I really don't see a change in the U.S. policy on the horizon. I think the White House is essentially locked into supporting Israel, probably up through the election here. I mean, it's absolutely disgraceful, but Biden has shown no indication that he ever wants to divert his support for Israel. And I think that's where we are. All right. Next up here, this one I wrote for the Institute on May 27th. Israeli Knesset considers law that will label UN aid agency as terror group. So the Israeli legislator plans to hold a vote on a bill that would name the UN aid agency for Palestinians, UNRWA, as a terrorist organization. Since October 7th, Israel has killed hundreds of UNRWA staff in Gaza and alleged the group has ties to Hamas. The Knesset plans to hold the preliminary vote on the law this week, probably Wednesday. The MK who introduced the bill explained the bill. The purpose of this bill is to declare UNRWA as a terrorist organization for all intents and purposes, as well as order the termination of the relations and cooperation of the State of Israel with the agency, either directly or indirectly. If the law passes the initial vote, it will still have to pass the first, second, and third readings. Since October 7th, Tel Aviv has targeted UNRWA on the ground in Gaza and the international press. Amid the Israeli onslaught, the aid agency has reported that nearly 200 of its staff have been killed in Gaza. Israeli officials have also smeared UNRWA to give cover for its slaughter of civilians in Gaza. In January, the International Court of Justice issued a preliminary ruling that it was plausible that Tel Aviv's mass slaughter in Gaza was a genocide. That same week, Tel Aviv claimed that UNRWA aided Hamas's attack on southern Israel. And this really did hijack the narrative to the extent of you had the ICJ come out, which is the UN court, this is the world court, and say that Israel was plausibly committing a genocide. This gets almost no attention in the American media, no attention in US politics. And the UNRWA claim, even though it was completely debunked, not proven, and in fact, the allegations that Israel made were generated. They generate these false confessions by torturing the staff of UNRWA, including waterboarding and threatening their families. And then when they said, oh, see, now you admit there's a member of Hamas, they used that to smear the group. And Congress, in that $95 billion foreign military aid bill, actually made it illegal for the U.S. to give any funds to UNRWA. So as you see, that Israeli PR campaign, while maybe not effective among the general public, was very effective in Washington. UNRWA has served a critical role in attempting to stem the humanitarian nightmare Israel caused in Gaza. Many Palestinians rely on UNRWA for food and shelter, as the Israeli military has destroyed their homes and blocked aid from reaching the Strip. Nearly all 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza are internally displaced and facing a catastrophic level of food insecurity. The latest Israeli attack on UNRWA also comes as the ICJ has condemned the Israeli offensive in Gaza. On Friday, the World Court ordered that Tel Aviv must halt its military operations in Gaza. Israel ignored the warning and appeared to step up the intensity of its attacks on the Strip. On Sunday night, at least 40 people, including women and children, were killed by an Israeli strike on a camp holding displaced Palestinians. And again, as you can see, there's just no concern from the Americans about this. You know, we're saddened by seeing the images, but we're not sure Israel did anything wrong, even though there's a bunch of beheaded kids. And by the way, remember, those beheaded kids that didn't exist after the Hamas attack are the excuse for a lot of, in the American politicians still cite that as the excuse that they use quite often for justifying their support for Israel. All right, next up here, this one from the Cradle. Israel has detained 9,000 Palestinians in the West Bank since October 7th. The Cradle reports the Israeli army has arrested around 20 Palestinians from the 25th to 26th of May, bringing the total number of arrests in the occupied West Bank since October 7th to over 8,875. The Commission for Detainees and Ex-Detainee Affairs and the Palestinian Prisoners Club jointly issued a statement revealing that the total arrests since October 7th has passed that number. According to the Palestinian news agency Wafa, the arrests over the weekend took place in several areas of the West Bank, including Jenin, Bethlehem, Hebron, Nablus, Ramallah, and Jerusalem. During the arrest campaign, Israeli settlers, accompanied by the police, entered the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in Jerusalem on the morning of May 26th. Local reports also indicate that the arrest raids caused widespread destruction of property. The report added that local enforcement was stationed at the gates of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and prevented tens of worshippers from entering. Additionally, Israeli forces distributed demolition notices on the same day for commercial shops along the road connecting Jabba and Qalanda military checkpoints situated north of occupied Jerusalem, and for a bridge linking the towns of Jabba and Al-Rama. So, of course, destroying the bridge is probably more serious as far as going to create a lot of disruptions for a lot of people. Of course, destroying the shops is absolutely a terrible thing to do, and it's going to destroy a lot of Palestinians' livelihoods and things like that as well. And a lot of these people who are placed in detention are going to be tortured, at least for the Palestinians that are being rounded up in Gaza. They are being put in 24/7 handcuffs and leg cuffs. They're so tight that they're causing the skin to cut. Eventually that turns into an infection. Israelis aren't treating them. And so those infections are spreading and amputations are occurring because of that. So people are using arms and legs from being held in restraints for so long. Of course, nobody is actually getting a trial or any kind of justice. And some people are actually dying from the sepsis and other medical neglect. It's absolutely horrific what the Israelis are doing to their detainees. All right, so this one from Jason Ditz, a little update on the escalations going on in Israel's northern border between Israel and Hezbollah. So, Israeli strikes killed 2 in southern Lebanon. An Israeli drone struck the entrance of the Salah Gondor hospital in Lebanon's eastern city of Bint Jabil today, killing an unidentified man on a motorcycle and wounding an estimated 10 others. 4 of the injuries were said to be in critical condition. Israel did not comment on the attack, which is not unusual for strikes with such uncertain outcomes. Hospital officials report that most of the wounded were family members or friends of patients who tend to congregate by the entrance. The hospital was said to have received some damage in the attack. A second strike came against a border village, with Israel saying they killed a Hezbollah member who was involved in a fire against the Israeli territory. Earlier in the day, Hezbollah fired an estimated 35 rockets against the base at Mount Meron in northern Israel. Reports from Israeli officials said the rockets landed in an open area and that there were no injuries. After the attack on the hospital, Hezbollah fired an additional 25 rockets against a northern Israeli city. Some of the rockets were intercepted, but ambulances were still in the area checking for wounded, and the results of the attack are so far unclear. The attacks came just a day after Israel carried out multiple attacks, again focusing on people riding on motorcycles across southern Lebanon. At least 8 people were killed and a number of others were wounded. All right, wrapping up here with one story on Niger. This from Dave DeCamp, May 20th at antiwar.com. U.S. to withdraw all troops from Niger by September 15th. So this seems like good news, but we still have a few months here where we're really going to have to hold our breath and hope that all 1,000 U.S. troops left in Niger are forced to leave the country. Of course, there's a very important American air base at that country, Air Base 201. that the U.S. spent a lot of money on and that they really don't want to give up. But I think they're going to be forced to. Again, if I were in Niger and I were a part of that country's leadership, I would be ushering the Americans out as quick as possible and very on guard of a potential coup until that time comes. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the show today. More later in the week.